I stood frozen in my sister Brittany's pristine living room as the cruel words echoed through the silence. "Your kids aren't important enough for my daughter's birthday party." My twin boys, 7-year-old Mason and Noah, clutched their handmade gifts, tighter tears streaming down their innocent faces like tiny rivers of heartbreak. The extended family sat in uncomfortable silence around the elaborate princess-themed decorations, their eyes darting between us nervously. My husband Jake watched our children's devastation unfold, his jaw tightening with barely controlled rage that I could feel radiating across the room. Without warning, he pulled out his phone, stood up slowly with deliberate purpose, and began dialing a number that would change everything forever. My name is Alethea, and at 32 years old, I thought I understood my family completely. As an elementary school teacher in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I believed in the power of kindness and second chances. My husband Jake owned a small auto repair shop where he worked 12-hour days with grease-stained hands and an honest heart. We lived modestly in a 2-bedroom ranch house with peeling paint and a garden where the boys grew tomatoes every summer. Our twin sons Mason and Noah had been counting down the days to their cousin Sophia's 8th birthday celebration. They spent 3 weeks creating handmade photo albums filled with crayon drawings of family memories and pictures from our weekend trips to the local park. With their saved allowance money, they purchased a small jewelry box from the dollar store, wrapping it carefully in newspaper comics because we couldn't afford fancy gift wrap. The contrast hit us immediately when we pulled into Brittany's driveway in our aging Honda Civic. Her mansion loomed before us like something from a magazine with perfectly manicured lawns and a circular driveway where luxury vehicles sparkled under the afternoon sun. Professional decorators had transformed the backyard into a fairy tale wonderland with towering balloon arches, crystal chandeliers hanging from temporary pavilions, and a dessert table that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. Mason tugged at his collared shirt nervously while Noah smoothed down his hair for the 20th time. They wore their cleanest clothes polo shirts I'd found at the thrift store and khaki pants that were slightly too short but still presentable. Around them, children emerged from Mercedes and BMWs wearing designer outfits with price tags that would make me dizzy. Brittany greeted the wealthy neighborhood families with theatrical enthusiasm, air-kissing perfectly made-up mothers while discussing private school fundraisers and vacation homes in the Hamptons. When she finally acknowledged our presence, her smile flickered like a dying light bulb. "Oh, you made it," she said with the enthusiasm of someone commenting on expired milk. Her gaze swept over my boys dismissively before returning to more important guests. The entertainment was elaborate beyond anything I'd ever seen at a child's party. A professional princess performer sang songs, while a magician made doves appear from silk scarves. Children squealed with delight as they rode ponies led around a temporary track. Mason and Noah stood on the periphery watching with wide eyes but too intimidated to join the other kids who seemed to inhabit a completely different world. When gift opening time arrived, Brittany arranged the presents in a hierarchy that made my stomach churn. Elaborate boxes with silk ribbons occupied the place of honor, while our simple offering was relegated to a corner like an afterthought. She opened expensive electronics designer clothing and jewelry with practiced enthusiasm, thanking each giver by name and holding up the gifts for photographs. Then she reached our boys' carefully wrapped present. The moment her fingers touched the newspaper comics, her expression shifted to barely concealed disgust. She unwrapped it with the same enthusiasm one might show for handling garbage, glancing briefly at the handmade photo album before setting it aside without comment. "Some gifts are more special than others," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. After all, not every child understands what quality really means. Mason's face crumpled, first followed immediately by Noah. They'd poured their hearts into creating something meaningful, and she'd dismissed their effort like it was worthless trash. The other parents shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, while others whispered among themselves. That's when Brittany delivered the killing blow that would haunt me forever. Honestly, your kids just aren't important enough for my daughter's birthday party. This is a celebration for children who matter in our community." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as my children's tears fell freely, now their small shoulders shaking, with the kind of pain that changes something fundamental inside a person's heart. Jake had been standing near the dessert table, but Brittany's words galvanized him into action. He pulled out his phone with movements that seemed almost mechanical. His face transformed from hurt confusion into something harder and more determined than I'd ever seen before. "Detective Rodriguez." Jake's voice carried clearly across the stunned gathering. "Yes, it's Jake Mitchell. Those photos we discussed last month? It's time. I'm ready to move forward with everything we talked about." The wealthy parents stopped their whispered conversations. Brittany's face went pale beneath her professionally applied makeup. Marcus, her husband, straightened up from where he'd been chatting with another father about golf handicaps. Jake listened to whatever Detective Rodriguez was saying on the other end, nodding grimly. "No, I'm certain. The evidence is solid and I can't watch this continue any longer. These people need to face the consequences of their actions." He ended the call and looked directly at Brittany with an expression that made her step backward involuntarily. "We're leaving now," he announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "But this conversation is far from over." As we gathered our devastated children and headed toward the exit, I caught glimpses of the other parents' confused faces. They had no idea what Jake's mysterious phone call meant, but something in his demeanor suggested that Brittany's cruel words had just triggered consequences she never saw coming. The drive home passed intense silence, broken only by Mason and Noah's occasional sniffles from the back seat. My mind raced with questions about Jake's phone call, but I knew better than to interrogate him while our children were processing their humiliation. Once the boys were settled in their room with ice cream and their favorite cartoons, Jake sat me down at our kitchen table with the gravity of someone about to confess a federal crime. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he opened a manila folder I'd never seen before. "I need to tell you something I've been investigating for the past month," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Remember when Marcus started bringing his cars to the shop more frequently, not for regular maintenance but for strange requests at odd hours?" I nodded, recalling Jake's complaints about Marcus calling at midnight for urgent repairs that seemed unnecessary. "It started when I noticed license plates." Jake continued spreading photographs across our worn Formica table. Different cars, different people, but they all had one connection. They were meeting with Marcus at locations that didn't make sense for real estate business. The photos showed Marcus in parking lots, abandoned warehouses, and strip mall offices that seemed far beneath someone of his supposed status. In several images, briefcases changed hands between Marcus and individuals who looked more like criminal enforcers than potential homebuyers. 3 weeks ago, a client mentioned seeing Marcus at a 24-hour diner at 2 in the morning, arguing with men who wore expensive suits but had prison tattoos visible on their necks. Jake explained. "That's when I started paying closer attention." He showed me financial documents that had been carelessly left in Marcus's vehicles during repairs. Bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of, property deeds for addresses that didn't exist, and transaction records that made no logical sense for legitimate business dealings. Detective Rodriguez has been investigating a money laundering operation that uses fake real estate transactions to clean money for organized crime, Jake said quietly. "The evidence I've been collecting fits perfectly with their ongoing investigation." My elementary school teacher's brain struggled to process this information. The Marcus I knew was pompous and materialistic, but I'd never imagined him capable of criminal activity on this scale. But there's something worse. Jake continued, his expression growing darker. Brittany isn't just an innocent wife who enjoys the benefits of ill-gotten wealth. She's actively involved in the operation. He produced a series of photographs that made my blood run cold. Brittany at coffee shops with women I recognized from charity events, but the meetings clearly weren't social gatherings. Money changed hands, documents were exchanged, and in one particularly damning image, Brittany appeared to be taking notes while one of Marcus's criminal associates spoke. She's been using her social connections to identify wealthy families for targeting, Jake explained. Those charity luncheons and book club meetings, their intelligence-gathering operations. She learns which families have money, which marriages are struggling, which elderly people might be vulnerable to financial manipulation. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Brittany's sudden transformation from a moderately successful marketing coordinator to a woman who wore designer clothes and drove luxury cars hadn't happened because she'd married well. It had happened because she'd married into crime. The elaborate lifestyle, the mansion, the expensive parties for Sophia. I whispered understanding flooding over me like ice water. It's all built on criminal proceeds. Jake nodded grimly. And today's cruelty toward Mason and Noah. That wasn't just typical Brittany meanness. It was part of her established pattern of manipulating and using people to maintain her position in the criminal hierarchy. He showed me bank records indicating regular payments to Brittany's personal accounts from shell companies that existed only on paper. Phone records revealed calls to numbers associated with known criminal enterprises. Even her social media posts had been carefully crafted to display wealth and status that attracted potential victims. Detective Rodriguez confirmed that several elderly residents in Brittany's neighborhood have been approached by friendly neighbors offering to help with financial planning. Jake continued. 3 families have already lost their retirement savings to investment scams orchestrated through Marcus's fake real estate company. The scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering. They weren't just laundering money, they were actively destroying lives while maintaining a facade of respectability and community involvement. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of deception in our family. "I needed to be absolutely certain before involving you," Jake replied. "And honestly, I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to believe that your sister was just married to someone shady, not actively participating in destroying people's lives." But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, photographs, witness statements, and documented connections to known criminals painted a picture of deliberate, calculated criminality that had been operating for years. Today's humiliation of our children was the final straw. Jake said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I can't watch her hurt innocent people any longer. Detective Rodriguez has enough evidence to move forward, and I'm ready to testify about everything I've discovered." As I absorbed the reality that my sister was not just cruel, but actively criminal, Jake's mysterious phone call finally made complete sense. He hadn't just been defending our children's honor. He'd been setting in motion the wheels of justice that would finally hold Brittany and Marcus accountable for the lives they'd destroyed. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, exhausted from crying, Jake spread the complete evidence file across our living room floor. The documentation painted a picture so comprehensive and damning that I struggled to reconcile it with the sister I thought I knew. Bank statements showed that Brittany had received over $200,000 in payments from shell companies over the past 18 months. Phone records revealed daily conversations with individuals whose names appeared on federal watch lists for organized crime activity. Even more disturbing were the handwritten notes in Brittany's precise script detailing the financial vulnerabilities of families she'd befriended through community organizations. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to a notebook page that made my stomach turn. Written in Brittany's familiar handwriting were names I recognized from our hometown, followed by notations like "widow lonely trusting" and "elderly widower substantial pension, no close family oversight." Mrs. Henderson from our old neighborhood was listed with the note, "recently diagnosed with dementia. Son lives out of state perfect target for financial manipulation." The Kowalski family, who'd always been kind to us growing up, was marked as struggling with medical bills, desperate enough to believe investment promises. She's been systematically cataloging vulnerable people for criminal exploitation. I whispered, feeling sick. These are families who trusted her, who considered her a friend. The evidence revealed that Brittany's transformation hadn't happened overnight. For 3 years, she'd been building relationships specifically to identify potential victims. Her involvement in charity organizations, neighborhood watch groups, and community boards hadn't been altruistic. It had been research for criminal enterprise. Jake showed me photographs taken through the windows of Marcus's home office, revealing wall-mounted charts that looked like something from a police investigation room. Red strings connected photographs of elderly residents to financial institutions, with sticky notes indicating account balances and family situations that might make them vulnerable to scams. She's not just participating in money laundering, I realized with growing horror. She's the architect of a systematic program to defraud elderly and vulnerable families in our entire region. The phone records showed that Brittany coordinated with criminal associates in 3 different states, sharing information about potential targets and receiving payments for successful fraud operations. She'd evolved from a small-town marketing coordinator into a key player in interstate criminal activity. But the most devastating revelation came when Jake showed me recordings he'd made during his late-night work at the shop. Using his phone, he'd captured conversations between Marcus and his criminal associates that took place in the parking lot outside Jake's garage. In one particularly damning recording, Marcus discussed Brittany's list of elderly targets, praising her ability to gain trust and extract financial information from vulnerable people. But even more shocking was Brittany's voice in the background, adding details about specific families and suggesting strategies for approaching them. The elderly woman on Maple Street just lost her husband. Brittany's voice was clearly audible, saying, she mentioned having substantial life insurance proceeds and no experience managing large sums of money. I've already offered to help her find a financial advisor. The casual cruelty in her tone as she discussed manipulating a grieving widow made me feel physically ill. This wasn't the sister I'd grown up with, or perhaps it was, and I'd simply never seen her true nature clearly before. Jake had also documented Brittany's role in recruiting other wealthy wives into peripheral aspects of the criminal enterprise. She'd convinced several women to invest in Marcus's fake real estate ventures, not realizing they were participating in money laundering operations that would eventually destroy their own families. She's been using her charm and social connections to expand the criminal network, Jake explained. Some of these women have no idea they're breaking the law, but Brittany knows exactly what she's doing. The evidence showed payments to Brittany for each successful recruitment, each vulnerable family identified, and each fraudulent transaction completed. She'd turned the manipulation of human trust into a profitable career, all while maintaining the facade of being a loving mother and community pillar. Looking back on our childhood with this new knowledge patterns I'd dismissed as typical sibling rivalry took on sinister new meaning. Brittany had always been skilled at manipulation, but I'd attributed it to charm and ambition rather than recognizing it as a fundamental lack of empathy that would eventually lead to criminal behavior. The cruelty toward Mason and Noah today wasn't an isolated incident, I realized. It was consistent with her pattern of viewing people as either useful or disposable based on what they could provide for her. Jake nodded grimly. Detective Rodriguez confirmed that this level of systematic exploitation typically escalates over time. People like Brittany don't stop until they're forced to stop. The recordings revealed that Brittany had been pressuring Marcus to expand their operations into neighboring states, targeting retirement communities and assisted living facilities where elderly residents might be more isolated and vulnerable. She's planning to destroy hundreds more lives, I said, feeling the weight of our family's connection to such evil, and she's using the respectability of marriage and motherhood as cover for criminal activity that's devastating entire communities. As I processed the scope of Brittany's betrayal of everything I believed about family and human decency, Jake's decision to contact Detective Rodriguez transformed from mysterious overreaction into moral imperative. The evidence was overwhelming, and the potential for future harm was enormous. Tomorrow we're meeting with Detective Rodriguez to provide formal statements, Jake announced. But first, I think Brittany deserves one opportunity to come clean and potentially cooperate with the investigation. The idea of confronting my sister with evidence of her criminal behavior terrified me, but I knew Jake was right. The families she'd already harmed deserved justice, and the families she was planning to target deserved protection. The next morning, I called Brittany with trembling fingers, trying to keep my voice steady as I suggested a family dinner to clear the air after yesterday's incident. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using deception to confront someone whose entire life had become built on lies. Oh, Alethea. Brittany's voice carried that familiar, condescending tone. I suppose we should discuss your children's behavior yesterday. They seemed so upset over nothing. Her casual dismissal of Mason and Noah's heartbreak as nothing reinforced everything Jake had discovered about her character. She genuinely viewed their pain as irrelevant, just as she viewed the suffering of her elderly victims as acceptable collateral damage. Yes, I think that conversation is overdue, I replied, managing to sound conciliatory while my stomach churned. Why don't you and Marcus come for dinner Saturday evening? We can have an honest discussion about family expectations. Brittany agreed readily, probably expecting an apology and hoping to further establish her dominance over what she perceived as our inferior family status. She had no idea that Jake's evidence file was sitting in our bedroom closet or that Detective Rodriguez would be positioned nearby during her visit. Jake spent Friday evening preparing copies of all documentation while I struggled with the emotional reality of my sister's criminal nature. The evidence was irrefutable, but part of me still hoped for some explanation that would make sense of the sister I'd loved and trusted for 32 years. Remember, our primary goal is protecting future victims, Jake reminded me as we reviewed the plan. If Brittany shows genuine remorse and agrees to cooperate with authorities, she might receive more lenient treatment. But if she continues the pattern of manipulation and denial, Detective Rodriguez is prepared to arrest both her and Marcus immediately. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Iowa. I'd prepared Brittany's favorite meal from childhood pot roast with mashed potatoes, hoping familiarity might soften whatever humanity remained in her heart. Mason and Noah were spending the night with Jake's parents, sparing them the trauma of witnessing their aunt's potential arrest. Brittany and Marcus arrived precisely on time, their luxury sedan gleaming in our modest driveway like an accusation. Brittany wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, while Marcus sported a suit that screamed expensive tailoring and criminal proceeds. What a quaint little place, Brittany observed as she entered our living room, her eyes cataloging our secondhand furniture and discount store decorations with obvious disdain. It's so authentic. The word authentic dripped with condescension, as if our honest lifestyle was something amusing rather than admirable. Marcus remained silent but alert, his eyes constantly scanning our home with the paranoid awareness of someone accustomed to criminal surveillance. During dinner, Brittany dominated conversation with stories about Sophia's private school achievements and their upcoming vacation to Europe. She made pointed references to the quality of Sophia's friends and their families' contributions to society that were clearly designed to emphasize our inferior social status. Sophia is learning French and violin, Brittany announced while cutting her pot roast with theatrical precision. It's important for children to develop sophisticated tastes early. Some families understand that investment in excellence pays dividends throughout life. Her implication that Jake and I were failing our children by not providing expensive extracurricular activities was delivered with surgical precision, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. She had no idea that within hours her daughter might be placed in protective custody, while her mother faced federal charges. Marcus contributed little to the conversation beyond grunts of agreement and nervous glances at his phone. His discomfort was palpable, suggesting he sensed something unusual about the evening, even if he couldn't identify the specific threat. I brought something for Mason and Noah. Brittany announced after dessert, producing an elaborate gift bag filled with expensive electronics. I realized yesterday that children from different backgrounds might need extra encouragement to feel included. The gift was clearly meant as a condescending gesture designed to emphasize her wealth while making us feel obligated to express gratitude for her generosity toward our disadvantaged children. She had no concept that her charity was built on criminal exploitation of families just like ours. That's very thoughtful. I managed to reply, though accepting gifts purchased with crime proceeds felt like participating in her corruption. Actually, there's something Jake and I wanted to discuss with you about family relationships and expectations. Jake had been unusually quiet during dinner, but now he stood up with deliberate purpose and retrieved the evidence file from our bedroom. Brittany's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to wary confusion as he placed the manila folder on our dining room table. "Before we begin," Jake announced calmly, "I should mention that Detective Rodriguez is aware of tonight's meeting and will be joining us shortly to discuss some concerns about criminal activity in our community." The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly, I thought he might faint. Brittany's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock that transformed her features from condescending superiority to genuine fear. "What are you talking about?" Brittany demanded, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "What criminal activity? What detective?" Jake opened the folder and began spreading photographs, bank statements, and recorded transcripts across our table with methodical precision. Each piece of evidence represented months of careful investigation and documented proof of systematic criminal enterprise. Detective Rodriguez has been investigating money laundering and elder fraud operations in central Iowa. Jake explained in a voice that remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "The evidence I've collected over the past month provides crucial documentation of criminal activity involving both of you." Marcus shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward, crashing to our kitchen floor with a sound like gunfire. His face had gone from pale to flushed red as he realized the scope of evidence spread before them. "This is entrapment," he sputtered, looking wildly around our kitchen as if escape routes might materialize. "You can't record private conversations without consent. This evidence is inadmissible." "Actually," Jake replied calmly, "Iowa is a one-party consent state for recording conversations that occur in public places. Everything documented here was obtained legally and has already been verified by federal investigators." Brittany remained seated, but her hands trembled as she examined the photographs of herself meeting with known criminals. Her usual composure had completely shattered, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath the facade of suburban respectability. That's when Marcus made the decision that would define the evening's outcome. Instead of accepting responsibility or attempting negotiation, he chose to throw Brittany completely under the bus. "This was all her idea," he announced, pointing at Brittany with undisguised panic. "I was just following her instructions. She's the one with connections to organized crime. She's the mastermind behind everything." Brittany's reaction to Marcus's betrayal was immediate and explosive. She leaped from her chair with feral intensity, her carefully constructed mask of suburban sophistication disintegrating completely. "You coward!" she screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that made our windows rattle. "You weak, pathetic excuse for a man. I created this entire operation while you sat in your office playing solitaire and complaining about quarterly taxes." The transformation was shocking in its completeness. The polished woman who delivered cutting remarks about my children's worthiness had vanished, replaced by someone whose fury revealed the calculating criminal underneath. "She's lying!" Marcus shouted back his desperation, making him reckless. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm willing to provide complete testimony about Brittany's criminal enterprise. I have documentation proving she initiated contact with organized crime figures. I have recordings of her planning fraud operations against elderly victims." "You have recordings?" Brittany's voice dropped to a deadly whisper that was somehow more terrifying than her screaming. You've been recording our private conversations while I built an empire that made us millionaires. The word empire revealed everything about how Brittany viewed her criminal activities. She wasn't a reluctant participant or someone who'd been manipulated into breaking the law. She was proud of what she'd accomplished through systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. Millionaires built on destroying families. I found my voice finally standing up to face the sister whose true nature had been revealed so completely. You've been stealing retirement savings from elderly people who trusted you. You've been manipulating grieving widows and isolated seniors. Brittany turned her fury toward me with laser focus, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes that genuinely frightened me. Not anger or frustration, but cold calculation, as she assessed me as a potential threat to be neutralized. "Don't lecture me about morality, Alethea," she hissed with venom that seemed to poison the very air between us. "You've always been jealous of my success, my intelligence, my ability to create opportunities instead of accepting limitations." Success. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You call destroying families success. You call exploiting vulnerable elderly people intelligence. I call it survival in a world where people like you accept mediocrity as virtue, Brittany shot back. While you've been content teaching other people's children for $30,000 a year, I've been building wealth that will secure Sophia's future forever. Her complete lack of remorse was staggering. She genuinely believed that criminal activity was justified if it provided financial security, and that people who chose honest work were simply too weak or stupid to pursue more lucrative alternatives. "Tell her about Mrs. Henderson," Jake interjected quietly. "Tell Alethea what you did to the widow with dementia whose husband died last spring." Brittany's expression flickered with something that might have been shame, but it passed so quickly, I wondered if I'd imagined it. "Mrs. Henderson is lonely and confused," Brittany replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "I helped her find investment opportunities that provided social interaction and financial growth. The fact that she's now financially secure in a lovely assisted living facility should be considered a positive outcome." "She lost her house," Jake said flatly. "She lost her independence. She lost contact with neighbors who'd been her friends for 40 years. You convinced her to invest her life savings in non-existent properties, then used her confusion to sign over power of attorney to criminals who moved her into an expensive facility that consumes her Social Security payments. She was going to lose everything anyway," Brittany snapped. "Elderly people with dementia can't manage financial responsibilities. I simply expedited an inevitable outcome while ensuring everyone benefited appropriately." The clinical coldness with which she described destroying an elderly woman's life was more disturbing than any amount of screaming or denial could have been. She'd rationalized her crime so completely that she genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would consider her actions wrong. "What about the Kowalski family?" I demanded, thinking of the couple who'd always been kind to us growing up. "What did you do to people who considered you a friend?" "The Kowalskis were drowning in medical debt from Tom's cancer treatments," Brittany replied without hesitation. "I offered them a lifeline through Marcus's investment opportunities. The fact that their financial situation didn't improve according to their expectations doesn't negate the assistance we provided during their crisis." "You stole their house," Jake said, consulting his notes. "You convinced them to use their home as collateral for investments that never existed. They're now living in their daughter's basement while paying monthly fees to criminal organizations that you connected them with. Business involves risk." Brittany shrugged with stunning indifference. "People who can't afford to lose money shouldn't make financial investments. I provided opportunities. I'm not responsible for their decision-making capabilities." Her complete lack of empathy for families whose lives she'd destroyed was breathtaking. She'd managed to rationalize criminal exploitation as legitimate business activity, viewing victims as responsible for their own destruction. Marcus, meanwhile, had been frantically scrolling through his phone while Brittany revealed the scope of her criminal mindset. His face grew increasingly pale as he apparently realized that his strategy of blaming everything on his wife might not provide the protection he'd hoped for. "Brittany," he said with new desperation in his voice, "you need to stop talking. Everything you're saying is being documented for criminal prosecution." "Let them document it," she replied with reckless fury. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished. While other women my age are volunteering at bake sales and carpooling children to soccer practice, I've been building a financial empire that spans 3 states. Her pride in criminal accomplishment was both fascinating and horrifying. She'd completely inverted normal moral standards, viewing criminal activity as evidence of superior intelligence and ambition. That's when Jake's phone rang and Detective Rodriguez's voice could be heard clearly requesting permission to enter our home. The legal proceedings were about to begin, but Brittany had already provided more incriminating testimony than any prosecutor could have hoped for. "You know what the truly beautiful part is?" Brittany continued, apparently unable to stop herself from revealing more details. "Sophia will inherit wealth that provides her with opportunities you could never imagine. Private schools, European universities, cultural experiences that will elevate her above families like yours forever. Sophia's going to inherit the knowledge that her mother was a criminal who destroyed families for money," I replied, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. "She's going to grow up knowing that everything she thought was normal was built on other people's suffering." For the first time since her confession began, Brittany's composure cracked slightly. The mention of how her criminal activity might affect her daughter seemed to penetrate her rationalization in a way that victims' suffering couldn't. But before she could respond, Detective Rodriguez knocked on our front door, and the evening's real reckoning was about to begin. Detective Rodriguez entered our home with 2 uniformed officers and a calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with the chaos of accusations and confessions that had been unfolding around our dining room table. She was a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had clearly seen enough criminal behavior to remain unfazed by Brittany's continued protestations. "Good evening, folks," she said, surveying the evidence scattered across our table and the obvious tension in the room. "I understand we have some voluntary statements to collect regarding ongoing criminal investigations." Marcus immediately began babbling about cooperation and immunity deals, while Brittany maintained defiant silence that somehow seemed more threatening than her previous confessions. The contrast between their reactions revealed different criminal personalities. Marcus was a weak opportunist, while Brittany was a calculating predator. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," Detective Rodriguez began, but Brittany interrupted with sharp laughter. "I understand my rights perfectly," she declared with renewed arrogance. "I also understand that successful prosecution requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, and circumstantial evidence rarely meets that standard in complex financial crimes." Her legal knowledge was disturbing, suggesting she'd anticipated eventual law enforcement scrutiny and prepared accordingly. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled into criminal activity. This was someone who'd studied how to commit crimes while minimizing legal vulnerability. Detective Rodriguez smiled grimly as she gestured toward Jake's evidence file. "Mrs. Patterson, we have 18 months of documented criminal activity, including recorded conversations, financial transactions, victim testimony, and surveillance footage. Your criminal enterprise has been under federal investigation since February." The confidence in Brittany's expression wavered as she realized the scope of law enforcement knowledge about her activities. She'd assumed her social status and careful planning provided protection, but federal investigators had been building cases against her network for almost 2 years. "We've also arrested 14 other members of your criminal organization this evening," Detective Rodriguez continued, "including several individuals whose testimony describes your role as the primary architect of elder fraud operations targeting vulnerable residents throughout central Iowa. Marcus collapsed into the nearest chair, apparently realizing that blame shifting wouldn't save him from prosecution when federal investigators had documented evidence of his active participation in money laundering operations. But perhaps most damaging to your legal position, Detective Rodriguez said consulting her notes is testimony from your 8-year-old daughter. Both Brittany and Marcus turned pale at the mention of Sophia. The idea that their criminal activity had been witnessed by their child introduced complications they clearly hadn't anticipated. Sophia. Brittany whispered, her criminal bravado finally cracking completely. What does she have to do with any of this? Children notice things adults assume they don't understand, Detective Rodriguez explained. Sophia has been providing detailed information about conversations she's overheard unusual visitors to your home and activities that frightened her enough to mention to her school counselor. The revelation that Sophia had been scared enough to seek help from school personnel suggested the criminal activity had created a threatening environment that traumatized the child Brittany claimed to be protecting through her crimes. She described men with guns visiting your house, Detective Rodriguez continued. She talked about finding large amounts of cash hidden in her playroom. She mentioned hearing you and Marcus argue about people who might cause problems if payments weren't made on schedule. Brittany's facade of maternal protection disintegrated as the reality hit her that criminal activity had exposed her daughter to genuine danger. The organized crime figures she'd partnered with weren't concerned about collateral damage to families, including children. Most significantly, Detective Rodriguez added, Sophia has been having nightmares about elderly people crying and asking for help. She told her counselor that mommy makes old people sad and she's afraid the same thing might happen to her grandparents. The 8-year-old had developed enough awareness of her mother's criminal activity to fear for her grandparents' safety. The psychological damage was already apparent and would require years of therapy to address completely. Where is Sophia now? I asked, suddenly terrified for my niece's immediate welfare. Child Protective Services took custody this afternoon, Detective Rodriguez replied gently. She's been placed with a foster family trained to work with children affected by parental criminal activity. Social workers will evaluate potential placement with relatives after background investigations are complete. Brittany finally broke down, completely sobbing with the kind of raw desperation that suggested she was beginning to understand the full scope of consequences her choices had created. But even her tears seemed calculated, designed to generate sympathy rather than expressing genuine remorse. I want to make a deal, Marcus announced suddenly. Complete cooperation, full testimony, whatever you need. I can provide details about criminal operations in 3 states and identify at least 30 victims who haven't been discovered yet. His willingness to betray criminal associates and provide evidence against Brittany revealed the coward underneath his expensive suits and arrogant demeanor. When faced with actual consequences, his loyalty extended only to self-preservation. We'll discuss cooperation possibilities after you've been formally charged and consulted with legal counsel, Detective Rodriguez replied. For now, you're both under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, elder fraud, and numerous related charges. As the officers began the arrest procedures, Brittany looked directly at me with an expression that contained no apology or recognition of wrongdoing. Instead, I saw cold hatred for my role in ending her criminal career. This isn't over, Alethea, she said quietly. You have no idea what you've started tonight. Her threat sent chills down my spine, but Detective Rodriguez had apparently anticipated this possibility. Mrs. Mitchell will be providing security recommendations for your family, she said. Criminal organizations don't typically retaliate against cooperative witnesses, but we take all precautions seriously. As they led Brittany and Marcus away in handcuffs, I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Justice was finally beginning, but the woman I'd called sister had revealed herself to be someone capable of genuine evil. Jake and I spent the rest of the evening providing detailed statements about our observations and the evidence he'd collected. The federal investigation was massive, involving multiple agencies and spanning several years of criminal activity. Your husband's documentation provided crucial evidence that accelerated our timeline, Detective Rodriguez explained as we finished the paperwork. Without his initiative, this criminal enterprise might have continued operating for years, destroying hundreds more families. The scope of potential future damage was staggering. Brittany and Marcus hadn't been planning to retire from crime. They'd been expanding operations and recruiting additional criminals to target vulnerable populations throughout the Midwest. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Jake and I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and processing the magnitude of what had occurred. My sister was in federal custody, facing decades in prison, and our family would never be the same. But somewhere in the city, an 8-year-old girl was waking up in foster care, wondering why her parents weren't coming home. That realization helped clarify my priorities for the difficult days ahead. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse watching my sister receive a 25-year prison sentence for orchestrating criminal enterprises that had destroyed 43 families across 3 states. Marcus received 18 years for his cooperation, but his testimony had provided crucial evidence that led to the conviction of an entire criminal network. The investigation had revealed that Brittany and Marcus's operation was far more extensive than anyone initially realized. They'd stolen over $3.8 million from elderly victims, manipulated dozens of families into foreclosure, and created fake charities that diverted funds intended for legitimate community assistance programs. But the most important outcome wasn't the criminal convictions or financial restitution. It was the 9-year-old girl sitting beside me in the courtroom, wearing a yellow dress and holding my hand with complete trust. Sophia's placement with our family had become permanent after extensive background checks and psychological evaluations. The transition hadn't been easy. She'd required months of therapy to process the trauma of learning that her parents were criminals who'd hurt innocent people. But children are remarkably resilient, and love provides healing that legal proceedings never could. "Is Mommy going to prison because she was mean to people?" Sophia had asked during one of our early conversations about her parents' legal situation. "Your mommy made choices that hurt families," I'd explained carefully. "Sometimes adults make very bad decisions, and there are consequences that help protect other people from being hurt." Sophia's integration into our family had been transformative for all of us. Mason and Noah, now 8 years old, had embraced their cousin with protective instincts that revealed their natural capacity for empathy. They'd learned that real family isn't defined by blood relationships, but by people who choose to love and support each other unconditionally. The financial restitution from Brittany and Marcus's criminal assets had been distributed among their victims, though money could never fully compensate for the trust and security they'd destroyed. Mrs. Henderson had been moved to a reputable assisted living facility where she received proper care, but she would never recover the independence and dignity that Brittany's manipulation had stolen. Jake's cooperation with federal investigators had earned recognition from law enforcement agencies, but more importantly, it had demonstrated to our children that standing up for justice sometimes requires courage and sacrifice. His auto repair shop had become a gathering place for families affected by the criminal network, providing both mechanical services and community support. "Daddy, why did you decide to help the police catch the bad people?" Mason had asked one evening while helping Jake organize tools in the garage. "Because sometimes good people have to do difficult things to protect families who can't protect themselves," Jake had explained. "When we see people being hurt and we have the power to help stop it, we have a responsibility to act." The legal proceedings had been emotionally exhausting, requiring testimony that forced us to relive Brittany's betrayal and criminal behavior repeatedly. But the process had also provided closure for victims who'd been wondering why trusted community members had suddenly disappeared with their life savings. Sophia's therapy had included family sessions where we'd learn to discuss difficult topics honestly while providing emotional security. She'd gradually come to understand that her parents' crimes weren't her responsibility, and that she could build a different kind of life based on truthfulness and compassion. "Alethea," she'd said one afternoon while we worked together in our garden. "I'm glad I live here now. I was scared in the big house because Mommy and Daddy argued about mean things all the time." Her relief at escaping the toxic environment of criminal activity confirmed that our family's intervention had protected her from continued psychological damage. Children shouldn't have to worry about whether their parents are hurting other people or whether dangerous criminals might visit their homes. The community response to the criminal network's exposure had been overwhelmingly supportive. Neighbors who'd been suspicious of Brittany and Marcus's sudden wealth had formed support groups for victims and their families. Local churches had established financial counseling programs for elderly residents, and law enforcement agencies had created educational presentations about recognizing and reporting elder fraud. Detective Rodriguez had visited our family several times during the legal process, partly for professional follow-up, but increasingly as someone who'd been moved by our commitment to justice despite personal cost. "Your decision to pursue this investigation probably prevented hundreds of additional victims," she'd told us during her final visit. "Criminal enterprises like theirs typically escalate until they're forced to stop. You didn't just get justice for past victims, you protected future families from devastation." But perhaps the most meaningful outcome had been the relationship that developed between Sophia and her elderly neighbors. She'd insisted on visiting Mrs. Henderson and other victims to apologize for her parents' behavior, even though she bore no responsibility for their crimes. "I'm sorry my mommy and daddy took your money," she'd told Mrs. Henderson during one particularly emotional visit. "I wish I could give it back to you." Mrs. Henderson had hugged her tightly and replied, "Sweet child, you're not responsible for your parents' choices, but you can choose to be the kind of person who helps people instead of hurting them." That conversation had crystallized something important for all of us about the nature of family legacy and personal responsibility. Children aren't defined by their parents' failures, but they can choose to learn from those failures and create different kinds of lives. Sophia's 9th birthday party had been a celebration of everything Brittany's elaborate extravaganza hadn't been. We'd invited neighborhood children regardless of their family's economic status, focusing on friendship and fun rather than displays of wealth. The decorations were homemade, the games were simple, and the gifts were thoughtful, rather than expensive. "This is the best birthday party ever," Sophia had announced while blowing out candles on a cake that Jake and the boys had decorated with uneven frosting and crooked letters. "Everyone is here because they wanted to be, not because their parents had to bring them." Her wisdom about authentic relationships had developed from witnessing the difference between connections based on mutual affection and those based on social obligation or financial manipulation. As I watched my expanded family playing in our backyard that afternoon, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Brittany's cruelty toward Mason and Noah had triggered a sequence of events that revealed her criminal nature, but it had also demonstrated that justice and love ultimately triumph over greed and manipulation. The boys had learned that standing up for what's right sometimes requires facing difficult truths about people we love. They'd seen that real strength comes from protecting others rather than exploiting them, and that family bonds are created through loyalty and compassion rather than shared DNA. Alethea. Jake had said one evening as we watched the children building a fort in our living room, "Do you think we made the right choice in pursuing the investigation? Look at them." I'd replied, gesturing toward 3 children who were collaborating on engineering problems and sharing snacks without concern for social status or material differences. We didn't just expose criminal activity. We saved a little girl and taught our sons that courage creates the foundation for authentic happiness. The final legal proceedings had concluded with victim impact statements that provided closure for families whose lives had been devastated by Brittany and Marcus's crimes. Elderly people who'd lost their homes and independence spoke about the psychological trauma of realizing they'd been betrayed by someone they'd trusted. But they'd also spoken about hope and resilience, about community support that had helped them rebuild, and about the satisfaction of knowing their suffering had led to justice that protected other families. The judge's final statement had captured something important about the nature of criminal manipulation and community responsibility. The defendants exploited fundamental human needs for trust and connection, weaponizing social relationships to commit systematic fraud. But their crimes were ultimately exposed through the courage and integrity of community members who chose justice over convenience. Today, 18 months after that devastating birthday party, our family celebrates every day the victory of love over cruelty, truth over deception, and justice over exploitation. Sophia thrives in an environment where adults tell the truth and protect children rather than using them as accessories to criminal enterprises. Mason and Noah have learned that real success comes from contributing positively to other people's lives rather than taking advantage of their vulnerabilities. They understand that wealth built on other people's suffering is actually poverty of the worst kind. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between family loyalty and doing what's right? How did you find the courage to stand up for justice when it meant confronting people you loved? Your experiences might help other families facing similar situations, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember that every day provides opportunities to choose compassion over cruelty, truth over deception, and love over manipulation. May your families be blessed with the kind of authentic relationships that provide real security and lasting happiness. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help it reach families who might need encouragement to pursue justice in their own difficult situations. Subscribe to hear more stories about courage, resilience, and the triumph of good over evil. And please share this with someone who might benefit from understanding that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, creates the foundation for genuine peace and happiness.